Hey everyone! This is a quick reminder to subscribe and hit that like button. It lets me know that you are enjoying my content. Also, feel free to drop your suggestions for future stories in the comments below. Thank you for listening, and let's dive right in. I've always loved living in downtown London. There's something comforting about the bustle of the city, the way the streets hum with life, even in the late hours. My apartment is small but cozy. A modest one-bedroom right above the antique shop that's been there as long as I can remember. The soft chime of the bell whenever someone enters is a background soundtrack to my days. I've lived here for 3 years now, and I've gotten used to it. Used to the quiet that falls over the street at night, the occasional sound of footsteps coming from the creaky shop below. I work from home as a graphic designer. Most days, it's just me and Tara, my calico cat, curled up in the corner by the window, keeping me company as I design logos, websites, and the occasional marketing materials. Tara's my little office buddy, although I swear she just likes to sleep on my desk and pester me for food when I'm in the middle of something. I'm not really one for a lot of human interaction, but I get along just fine with my neighbor, the elderly woman who runs the antique store beneath me. Her name is Mrs. Aldridge, and though she's always been a bit quirky, I've come to appreciate her strange ways. She's one of those people who seems to have lived 100 lifetimes, always telling me stories about the trinkets in her shop, how some are centuries old, how others are not quite of this world, as she puts it. She's always been kind to me, and I've often helped her with small errands or moving things around when she's not feeling well. I've never thought much of it. Life just happens, right? It was a quiet afternoon when the ambulance arrived. I was sitting at my desk, earbuds in, focusing on a project, when I heard the faint sound of sirens growing louder. I pulled one earbud out and glanced out the window. From my vantage point, I could see the street below. Everything was calm until a paramedic van screeched to a halt in front of the store. My heart skipped a beat. I squinted, trying to make out the scene unfolding below. There, being lifted onto a stretcher, was Mrs. Aldridge. She looked so frail, her silver hair cascading in messy waves over the pillow they had placed under her head. A knot tightened in my stomach. I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my keys, rushed out the door, and hurried down the stairs. I wasn't sure what had happened, but I knew I needed to be there. By the time I reached the sidewalk, the paramedics were loading her into the back of the ambulance. I approached quickly, my breath catching in my throat. "Mrs. Aldridge," I called out, my voice a little more panicked than I intended. She turned her head, blinking at me with hazy eyes, clearly disoriented but still conscious. Her lips twitched into a weak smile. "Oh, Kayla, my dear," she said softly. "I didn't mean to trouble anyone." "Trouble? Mrs. Aldridge, what happened?" I asked, my voice tight with concern. I slipped," she mumbled. "I was coming down the stairs, and my legs gave out. I'm old, you know. I should be more careful." The paramedic nodded. "We're just taking her to the hospital to check for any broken bones or concussion. It's routine." "I'm sure it's nothing serious," Mrs. Aldridge continued, her voice barely audible. "But while I'm gone, Kayla, could you?" I leaned in closer. "What is it? Is there anything I can do?" She paused, her eyes flickering to the ambulance doors. "I need you to look after the shop while I'm away, just for a little while I recover. It's nothing difficult, I promise. Just keep it open. Keep an eye on things." My heart skipped again, but this time for a different reason. I'd helped her before with little tasks, but I'd never been responsible for running the shop. Still, how could I say no? "Of course I'll help," I said quickly, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "But, you're sure you're okay?" "I'll be fine," she said with a reassuring nod. "I just need rest. And..." She paused, her voice dropping lower. "The keys are in my apartment. The drawer by the counter. There's also a rule book there. Please read it, it's important. The shop is special. Just follow the rules and you'll be fine." I didn't fully understand what she meant, but I nodded. "I'll read it, I promise." "Don't worry, Mrs. Aldridge. You just focus on getting better." Her frail hand reached out, giving my arm a light squeeze. "Thank you, Kayla. I knew I could count on you." The paramedics closed the doors and the ambulance sped off, leaving me standing there on the sidewalk, holding the keys to her store. I stood frozen for a moment, my mind racing. What had she meant by the shop being special? And what kind of rules would there be for a small, quirky antique shop? The whole thing seemed a little strange. I figured it was just her usual oddity. Mrs. Aldridge had a way of saying things that made everything sound more mysterious than it probably was. I shook my head, trying to shake off the weird feeling in my stomach, and made my way back upstairs to grab my laptop. I figured I could at least work from the shop while keeping an eye on things. I could always take my laptop and sit behind the counter. Right? How hard could it be to run an antique store for a day or two? With a final glance at the empty street below, I closed my apartment door behind me, grabbed my things, and headed back downstairs. I unlocked the shop's front door and stepped inside. The familiar scent of old wood and dusty antiques greeted me, and for a second, I thought I'd be fine. But then, something felt off. There was a strange chill in the air. I shook it off and turned the sign to open, just as Mrs. Aldridge had told me to do. I sat behind the counter and pulled out my laptop, ready to work, but then I remembered. The rule book. With a sigh, I stood up and walked over to the counter. The first drawer. The one with the important rule book. I opened it, and as my fingers brushed against the pages, I couldn't shake the feeling that the day ahead would be anything but ordinary. The first few pages were mundane enough: store hours, how to use the cash register, where to find certain items if customers asked. It wasn't much different from any other job, really. I felt a little silly for worrying so much. I could do this. I could keep the shop running while Mrs. Aldridge recovered. But as I kept reading, the rules started to get odd. Never buy anything from the man in the blue suit. My brow furrowed. What? I flipped another page. The handwriting was shaky now, the ink almost faded. If you hear someone call your name from the back of the store, do not answer. Do not go looking. My stomach flipped. Do not engage with the old woman with the basket of herbs. She does not buy. She only takes. I read on, the words becoming more strange, more unsettling. If the lights flicker, stay still. Wait for them to stop before moving. What is this? I muttered to myself, setting the book down for a moment. The rules seemed nonsensical, out of place, and yet there was an undeniable weight to them, like they were serious, important. Just as I was about to turn the page, the door chime rang. A customer. I glanced up. A man in a blue suit stood in the doorway. I froze. It was him. The man in the blue suit. My mind raced back to the rule in the book. I had just read it. I couldn't ignore it. I swallowed hard, trying to remain calm. Can I help you? I asked, my voice steady, even though my heart was pounding in my chest. The man smiled, a thin, tight-lipped smile that made my skin crawl. He placed a large, odd-looking statue on the counter. It looked like a twisted, ancient figure, its features obscured by layers of grime and time. I couldn't place it, but something about it felt wrong. This, the man said, his voice smooth, almost coaxing, is an ancient relic from the Far East. It holds great value. I tried not to let my unease show. I'm afraid I'm not able to buy anything today. The owner of the store, Mrs. Aldridge, is in the hospital. I'm just taking care of the shop for her while she recovers. The man's smile didn't falter, but something in his eyes darkened. I understand, but you must see the value in this piece. It's one of a kind. You won't find anything like it anywhere else. Surely, you can make an exception for such a rare item. I clenched my hands together under the counter. My mind flashed back to the rule book. I'm really sorry, I said, forcing a polite smile, but Mrs. Aldridge has always been very clear about the shop's policies. I'm afraid I'm not authorized to make purchases. The man's smile faltered for a second, and then he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, insistent tone. You don't understand, do you? This is a chance to own something priceless, something that others would die for. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, but I stood firm. I'm sorry, but I really can't. For a moment, the man's eyes flashed with anger. He straightened up, adjusting his suit as though he'd been insulted. You'll regret this. People like you always do. He turned and walked out of the store, his footsteps loud in the otherwise silent shop. But as he passed, he swung his arms wide in a sudden burst of frustration, knocking over several glass items on a nearby shelf. The crash of breaking glass echoed through the room, sharp and jarring. My heart raced as I rushed to the mess, kneeling to pick up the broken pieces. My hands shook as I swept the shards into a dustpan. The shop was quiet again, save for the faint hum of the overhead lights. But then, just as I finished cleaning, the door chimed again. A woman entered, her blonde hair tied back in a messy ponytail. She looked to be about my age, maybe a little older. "I'm looking for a flute," she said, glancing around the store. "Do you have any?" I forced a smile. "I'm afraid I'm just taking care of the store while Mrs. Aldridge is gone. But feel free to look around. If you need help, let me know." She nodded, wandering off toward the back of the shop. I returned to the counter, my mind still racing from the encounter with the man in the blue suit. I need to focus. Just keep it together. Follow the rules. I picked up the rulebook again, scanning it for anything that might be relevant. And that's when I saw it. Never let the young woman play the flute. A cold wave of dread washed over me. I looked up, my heart pounding. The woman was holding a flute in her hands, examining it like she was trying to decide whether or not to buy it. I couldn't breathe. The rule was clear. I rushed to her, my feet moving before my brain could catch up. "Please don't play it," I said, almost out of breath. "If you want to buy it, that's fine, but no playing in the store." The woman looked at me with a strange grin, too wide, too unnatural. Her lips twisted as she held the flute in front of her, but she didn't argue. She took the flute, handed me the money, and walked out without another word. I stood there, watching her leave, and heard a faint, eerie sound in the distance. A flute. The air in the shop seemed to thicken, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I turned back to the counter, my hands trembling as I reached for the rulebook again. The words in front of me seemed to blur as my mind raced. I flipped through the pages, faster this time, my fingers practically flying over the paper. I was desperate for something, anything, that would explain the strange sense of dread settling in my chest. I didn't want to go back through those rules again. I didn't want to read them, but I had to. They were becoming more than just a list of strange guidelines. They were a map for surviving this night. But the rules, they were endless. Never open the door for the man who knocks after midnight. Do not ask the child where it came from. Never accept a gift from the woman who smells like roses. My head was spinning, the words running together. I felt dizzy, like the walls were closing in. The shop was too quiet, too still. Too wrong. The distant flute sounds seemed to swirl around me, growing louder. I couldn't focus. My hands kept trembling as I turned the pages of the rulebook. Each new page felt like a weight pressing down on me, each rule a warning that seemed more ridiculous and terrifying than the last. But the more I read, the more I understood. I wasn't just sitting here, passing time, waiting for the night to end. I was playing a part in something far darker. There were more rules, so many more. The ghost family looking to buy bones, never refuse them, always sell them the bones kept at the back. If a man who looks like a mechanic or electrician offers to fix something, don't let him do it. If you do, make him return the items he took. My head was swimming. My pulse thudded in my ears. Bones. Mechanics. Why in the world did these things keep showing up in the rulebook? The old lady had warned me about these rules, but I had no idea just how bizarre they would get. I looked up from the book for a moment, scanning the shop. The store felt too quiet now. The distant flute sounds had stopped, but a different tension was building in the air. I felt it, like a thick fog settling over me. And then, just as I was starting to lose my grip on reality, the door chimed again. A family walked in. At first, I thought they were just another odd set of customers, but as they moved closer, I realized something was wrong. They were too pale, their faces almost ashen, their movements too deliberate, too unnatural. They looked like they had stepped out of another time, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their eyes vacant and hollow. The man in the family, who looked like the father, stepped forward first, his voice eerily calm. "Excuse me," he said, "we are looking to purchase some bones." I froze. Bones? I had read about this in the rulebook, but hearing it out loud made it so much worse. I swallowed hard and forced myself to speak. We don't usually sell bones," I said, my voice sounding weak even to my own ears. But then I remembered the rule. "Actually, we do have some in the back. Let me grab them for you." I forced a smile, but inside I was screaming. I led them toward the back of the store, my legs trembling as I passed shelves stacked with strange trinkets and antiques I barely recognized. The further I went, the more oppressive the air felt. The walls seemed to close in, the dim lighting casting strange shadows that danced along the corners of the room. I grabbed a small box of bones that was tucked away on one of the higher shelves. White, brittle bones, some of them cracked and discolored. I didn't know what kind of bones they were, or where they came from, but I couldn't question it. Not now. I brought the box to them, and they all reached forward with eerily synchronized movements, taking the bones without a word. The father nodded. "Thank you." His voice was flat, but I could hear the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. And just like that, they turned and walked out of the shop, vanishing as quickly as they'd come. I stood there, in the back of the shop, shaking, my heart thudding in my chest. What had just happened? What were those people? I looked around at the bones in my hands, wondering how long they'd been there. And more importantly, why they had to be sold. I barely had time to process what had just happened before another customer entered. A middle-aged man, wearing greasy overalls and a tool belt. He had the look of a mechanic, or maybe an electrician. Someone who spent most of his days working with his hands. He glanced around the shop, his eyes falling on me almost immediately. He didn't seem out of place, but my nerves had already been frayed by the ghost family. And now, with another rule to follow, I wasn't sure I could handle much more. "Good evening," the man said, his voice friendly, though his eyes seemed to scan the shop more than he scanned me. "Hi," I said, trying to keep it casual. "How can I help you?" The man gave me a tight smile. "I was told by the landlord that some things need fixing. I'm here to take care of it." I felt a cold wave wash over me as I remembered the rule. Never let a man who looks like a mechanic or electrician fix anything in the store. If you do, make him return the items he took. I glanced around, trying to keep my composure. "I'm not expecting any repairs," I said, my voice more firm than I felt. "I'm just here to keep an eye on the store for the owner. I think there's been a mistake." The man didn't seem to take the hint. "I'm sure there's been a mix-up, but I was called to do the work." He took a step toward me, and I immediately took a step back. I remembered the rule. I couldn't let him near anything. I couldn't let him touch anything in the store. "Sorry," I said, forcing a smile. "But I really don't think there's anything that needs fixing here." He frowned, his smile fading into something more insistent. "Come on. I'm just trying to help." He stepped closer. "I'll make it quick. Just let me take a look. It'll be fine." Something about his tone, the way he spoke so smoothly, made my skin crawl. I didn't want to find out what would happen if I let him near anything. "No," I said, voice shaking now. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." He hesitated, his eyes narrowing, but then, with a disgruntled sigh, he stepped back and turned to leave. As he did, I noticed something. There, just as the door was closing behind him, he slid his hand into his pocket, and when he pulled it out again, he was holding a small, shiny object, a silver pocket watch. Before I could even blink, he was gone. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the watch in his hand, the strange feeling in my chest growing tighter. I had no idea what just happened, but something about that man felt wrong. As the evening stretched on, more customers trickled in, some normal, some not so much. I was losing track of the rules, of the strangeness surrounding me. Every interaction felt like a test. Every movement, a decision that could send me spiraling into something worse. I glanced over at the rulebook again, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It wasn't just a set of guidelines, it was my lifeline. If I broke any of these rules, I wasn't sure what would happen. But I knew one thing for sure: I was running out of time. By the time the sun set, the antique store felt like a different world. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the shadows seemed amplified in the quiet of the evening. I was exhausted, my head spinning from the bizarre encounters and the growing sense of dread gnawing at me. My eyes were heavy, but I couldn't stop reading the rulebook. I had to finish it. I had to know what was coming next. The shop's hours were nearing their end, and I'd thought about leaving 100 times, just locking the door and heading up to my apartment to forget the chaos. But I couldn't. Not with the rulebook in my hands. Not with the strange instructions piling up. The rules were my only safety. If I stopped following them, what would happen? I flipped to the next page, my eyes scanning the text in the dim light. If you see a shadow moving on its own, don't touch it. Let it pass. I felt a chill, as if the very air had dropped in temperature. I turned the page, eager to move on. If you hear tapping on the window, do not investigate. I felt a wave of nausea rush over me. I had been hearing tapping at the window for the past few hours. It was faint, rhythmic, like the tapping of someone's fingers. But I couldn't bring myself to look. Not after reading that. Something told me that if I investigated, I would never come back. I closed the rulebook and set it on the counter, trying to calm my nerves. The last thing I wanted to do was dwell on the words on the page. I glanced around the shop, every corner now feeling like it was hiding something. The shelves with their dusty antiques and strange trinkets, what had been quaint earlier in the day now looked menacing, their contents shifting in the corners of my vision, just beyond my reach. And then, the bell above the door jingled again. A man entered. An elderly man, bent with age, his face creased with deep lines, but his eyes, they were blank. Empty. He didn't say a word, not a greeting, not a hello. He just walked up to the counter and placed a small, intricately carved box on it. I froze. My heart slammed against my chest. The rulebook. I knew what it said. Don't accept strange boxes from quiet customers. My hand started to shake. I glanced at the man, his eyes unfocused, his breath slow. The box sat there on the counter, its wood dark and polished, almost inviting. I could feel my pulse racing as I remembered the rule in vivid detail. I cleared my throat. I'm sorry, sir, I can't accept that. He didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at the box, waiting for me to take it. I swallowed hard, my mind screaming at me to follow the rules, to not engage. I'm really sorry. I'm just filling in for the owner right now, and... He blinked but still didn't speak. He turned and walked away, slow and steady, the door chiming softly as he exited. I stood there, frozen, staring at the empty counter where the box had been. My mind was racing, my body trembling. What was that box? Why had he given it to me? What would have happened if I'd taken it? I didn't want to find out. I finally moved, locking the door behind the elderly man and breathing a sigh of relief. The shop was empty now, eerily quiet. I was almost there. Just a little longer. I walked to the back of the store, trying to ignore the unease growing in my chest. I didn't want to be here anymore, I just wanted to go home. I checked the clock, only a few more minutes before the shop officially closed. My relief was short-lived, however, when I heard a faint knock at the door. My breath caught in my throat. I turned to look. Nothing. The door was still locked. I hadn't heard anyone enter. I hesitated, but then, another knock. The sound was softer this time, as though whoever was outside was trying to get my attention. Slowly I approached the door. I peeked through the window, but no one was standing outside. The night air was still. No one was there. But something in the distance caught my eye. A shadow. It was faint at first, but as I watched, it slowly grew clearer. A silhouette of the old lady. She was standing at the far end of the street, watching me. Her frail form barely visible in the dim streetlights, but I knew it was her. Her figure was just so unmistakable, even from a distance. I blinked, but when I opened my eyes again, the shadow was gone. I rushed to the door, throwing the lock, flinging it open. But when I stepped outside, the street was empty. The cold hit me like a slap in the face. I was standing on the sidewalk, the night air sharp and bitter, but there was no sign of the old lady. No sign of anyone at all. Just the distant echo of my own footsteps as I walked to the end of the street, scanning every shadow. Nothing. I turned back toward the shop, my chest tight with fear, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me. My heart was pounding, my limbs shaky, and the rulebook felt like a lead weight in my hands. I locked the door behind me, bolted the windows, and took one last look around the shop. I had followed every rule I could remember. The night was finally over. But somehow, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. Something was still waiting. The morning after felt surreal. I woke up to the soft light of dawn seeping through the blinds. My head throbbed as I slowly came to my senses, replaying the events of the night before. The shop, the rules, the strange customers. My heart still raced with an unease that gnawed at me, the memories of everything that had happened feeling far too vivid to be a simple nightmare. Tara, my calico cat, rubbed against my legs, purring contentedly, blissfully unaware of the terror I had experienced. I sat at the edge of my bed, staring at the key in my hand. The key to the antique shop. I could still hear the faint echoes of the rulebook's words in my head. Do not answer if you hear your name called from the back of the store. Never accept anything from the man in the blue suit. The list of strange rules seemed endless, and my stomach churned as I wondered if I would ever get any answers. My thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, and I froze. For a split second, I wondered if something was still wrong, if I had missed something, if the shop would call me back again, even after I thought it was over. When I opened the door, I was surprised to see the old lady standing there, a bright smile on her face, as if nothing had happened the night before. She looked perfectly fine. The frailty I'd seen in her last night was gone. She was standing straight, her back unbent, no sign of injury or exhaustion. It was as though the ambulance ride and her fall had never happened at all. "Good morning, dear," she greeted, her eyes twinkling with the same warmth they always held. "I trust you had a good night?" I blinked, momentarily unsure how to respond. You're okay?" I asked, my voice shaky. You were in the hospital last night, weren't you?" She laughed softly, waving her hand dismissively. "Oh, it was just a little tumble. Nothing to worry about. I'm as good as new." I stood in the doorway, staring at her, trying to reconcile the cheerful woman in front of me with the fragile, injured person I'd seen last night. Something wasn't right. I don't understand," I murmured. "I saw you in the ambulance. You looked." She interrupted gently, her smile never fading. "Don't worry about it, dear. The doctors just wanted to be cautious, you know? I've had worse falls, but thank you for taking care of the shop while I was away." Her words didn't quite settle the storm in my mind. I couldn't help but wonder what was really going on. How could she be so fine? What was the truth? "You're welcome," I said quietly, stepping aside to let her in, but she shook her head. No, she said. "I'm fine. And now I'm back to take over. I must say, I'm impressed you kept the shop open. That was kind of you." The truth hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. I still had so many questions, but something told me I wouldn't get any answers today. I forced myself to speak, my voice tight. I don't understand the rules, though. The things I had to do last night, the customers, they were strange. What were those rules about? What did you mean when you said—" I hesitated, struggling to find the right words. The old lady's face shifted slightly, a shadow crossing her features for a fraction of a second, before she returned to her warm, enigmatic smile. "Some things are better left unsaid, dear. Some things need to be left where they are. But you did well. You followed the rules, and that's what kept you safe." "But what were the rules for?" I pressed. "Why didn't you warn me? What were those people? What's really going on?" She placed a hand on my arm, her touch gentle but firm. "Kayla, some things don't make sense to those who aren't meant to understand them. Some people bring color to the world, and others try to take it away. I just keep them from doing that. I protect the balance." I stood there, my mind racing, but I didn't know what to say anymore. Her words didn't make sense, but I had no choice but to accept them. The feeling of something off still lingered in the pit of my stomach, a gnawing sense of unease that wouldn't go away. The old lady looked at me then, her eyes sharp, as though she were reading my thoughts. "You did a fine job, Kayla. I appreciate your help more than you know." And just like that, as if everything had been perfectly normal, she extended her hand to me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the key to the shop, pressing it into her palm. "Here. The shop's all yours." Her smile widened, her eyes glinting with an unspoken understanding. "Thank you," she said softly, "but you should rest now. I'll take care of the rest." I nodded and stepped back, unsure of what to feel. Relief? Fear? Something else? I couldn't even name it. I just wanted to be done with it all. I couldn't help but feel that the world had shifted somehow. Something had changed, something unseen, and I didn't know how to process it. I had done my part. The shop was no longer mine to look after. I leaned against the door, staring at the empty hallway. I couldn't shake the words she'd said, the cryptic way she spoke, the mystery surrounding her. Some people bring color to the world, others take it away. What did that mean? I didn't have the answers, and I was starting to think I never would. The old lady had her secrets, and now they were hers to keep. I felt the weight of it all press down on me as I slowly walked back into my apartment, trying to forget the strangeness of it all, trying to let the quiet of my own apartment soothe me. But I knew, deep down, that I wouldn't forget. Not ever.